Hello, patrons and followers of Diplomacy Direct. Today, we are going to touch upon the fundamentals of any nation's process of identifying and prioritizing its geopolitical interests under Doctrine of National Security. Generally, this encompasses the entire mechanism of governance from the military readiness, diplomatic stand, the economic resilience, and social policies that are designed to protect and promote the country's national security interests. India does not have any such doctrine as yet, and today, with Dr. Gary Lilienthal, will evaluate today's necessity of national security doctrine. Quick introduction. Professor Dr. Gary Lilienthal is an academician extraordinaire, to say the least, who has taught at law schools and presided on committees on governance and social affairs in Australia, Malaysia, India, Ethiopia, Uzbekistan, and the United States. He has a doctorate in law and master's degree in psychoanalysis with focus on Freudian and Lacanian theories. He is widely published internationally on legal and constitutional matters, mainly into human rights, social governance, diplomatic law, and national security. In India, as scholar in residence, he was awarded the Silver Medal in National Security Law for his work with the Indian National Security Council on the Chinese perception of international law. He now chairs the Carrington Rand collaboration of more than 60 scholars from around the world. Carrington Rand develops and publishes journal papers as pilot research projects, identifies their research gaps for purposes of commercialized research for governments across the globe. So it's my pleasure to have you here on Diplomacy Direct. Welcome to Diplomacy Direct, Professor Lilienthal.
It's good to be here.
To start with, Professor, how can we substantiate saying that it's necessary that a country's national security doctrine should be a living, breathing, ever evolving mechanism and not only a constitutional requisite document?
I'm going to be looking to the side from time to time when I answer your questions because I have my iPad here with my notes on it next to my laptop. So don't worry if I'm looking to the side. But the first thing, let me say, is I don't like this term living, breathing. It's a term borrowed from business, and I don't like business language because it's full of spatial metaphors and it creates chaos in communication. Having said that, I don't have any problem with national security issues changing. Let's look at the hierarchy. First of all, when you understand the ancient law, and I mean the law going back many thousands of years, it's very clear that the king's first and main duty is to make war. And that's written in all the ancient treatises. If the king can't make war and win the war, he loses his throne and the state may fall, the kingdom may fall. And recently I wrote an entry for the Edward Elgar Encyclopedia of Criminal Law in the UK on the doctrine of necessity. And you used the word necessity in your question. And in my research of the doctrine of necessity, and I haven't forgotten the word doctrine either, we can't pass over that, we'll have to see what that means. It's entirely procedural. I don't know how you can substantiate something that's procedural, but necessity means acting when you're in a state of war. That's what it means. And if you take together the fact that the king's primary duty and obligation is to make war on behalf of the kingdom, and that when you're in a state of threat, and these threats are acts of war, such as what happens from time to every country. I'm thinking of the Chinese invasion of India many, many decades ago. And when I was in India, I met a general in Pune who had fought in that war. And it was interesting to hear him talk about how unexpected it was And you realize that any state has grounds for war at any time, which means they're always under pressure to act where necessary, because necessity means outlining the war. Now, on the constitutional level, simple. King must make war. That's the constitutional proposition. Come down a little. This is your living, breathing part. We go to something like the treatise of Sun Tzu, or many people say Sun Tzu, and we see on looking at his work that he's identified 9 different kinds of ground. So your ground can change its character anytime, depending upon your policies and your government and what your opponent's doing. Those 9 grounds are dispersive ground, facile ground, contentious ground, open ground, ground of intersecting highways, serious ground, difficult ground, and hemmed-in ground, and desperate ground. You could see by what's happened in India in the last few years that some of these grounds have constellated and the authorities have had to act. So living, breathing, when you see that an enemy is attacking your flank, a flank psychoanalytically meaning a part of the battlefield that you're, for the time being, unable to cognize, when you finally cognize it, you've got to act. And you live and you breathe this moment, and there's the fog of war, and you have to assess the ground, and you have to develop your strategy and tactics accordingly. So that answers that question, I think. And I think India does have a national security doctrine. From what I saw when I met the military people on the National Security Council, these people are very smart. They know exactly what they're doing. They understand military theory. They have military training. They've been drilling and maybe been in combat for many, many years, that I wouldn't ever distrust in their advice to the ruling elite in India. I think it has a very good national security doctrine.
Sir, from where I see, from you covered your interaction with the Indian military and about the implementation of the doctrine. From where I see, from India's perspective on national security mechanism, in addition to provisions to the doctrine, actually is in a way set in the National Security Act of 1980. There's a need to academically deliberate on the doctrine of necessity and this relationship which you just mentioned with the war and the military readiness by balancing act, basically with democratic legal concepts of tort, military necessity, criminal law, mainly into counterterrorism actions, and a fundamental state of necessity. Uh, and this democratic alignment had led us to today's multilateral military alliances. So now, with strategic security alliances, example, our Quad, do you think that the members should alter, adopt, or align their security framework to best fit the others? And which elements should a nation focus first to make amendments, and which shouldn't be compromised at all? So, what's your take on that?
I don't think that the Indian national security doctrine begins with a recent statute. I think it's thousands of years old. Some time ago, I published a paper with a colleague in Jabalpur on Indian water law and regulation of water, and we included in the research an examination of the ancient rivers in India, and how what people regard as religious issues with the rivers are in fact very ancient legal systems in order to regulate and contain and secure the water supply. Now, a couple of years ago, I headed up a research project on the fundamental characters of the legal systems along the Nile River in Africa, starting with the Blue Nile in Ethiopia meeting the White Nile in Khartoum in Sudan, and then traveling through Egypt. And we worked out that the Ethiopian system is its land system that surrounds and governs the water is an ancient domain system. So it's a Middle East system that's been around for tens of thousands of years. They have public domains, private domains, domains that are neither. And that's the way they regulate the water along the river. Then as you move into the Republic of Sudan, you have a land title system that's entirely based on usufructuary title, which means if the farmers can't produce a crop, they're removed from the land. So every time the water doesn't provide the proper fertility to the land, farmers lose their jobs. And that creates all sorts of necessary situations. And I use the word necessary as I did in your first question. But finally, and here's the point, the water flows into Egypt, and there are no substantive statutes on water control in Egypt. Rather, there's a hymn, H-Y-M-N, a hymn, thousands of years old, written by an engineer thousands of years ago, that completely regulates the water system. And it's cognate to what's going on in India. And India is known in the region as a water hegemon. Now, this is not the kind of hegemony you get with democratic states. I'll talk about that in a later question when we talk about the theories of Antonio Gramsci and how it affects national security. But nevertheless, it's hegemony. And India has been very strong in maintaining its water hegemony. And the rivers have been governed the same way for thousands of years. And nobody gets in the way because people are affected by the hegemony. So, having said that, as a background to what I want to bring this to, when a country joins something like the Quad, and the Quad to me is morally neutral. I have no political or moral position about goodness or badness of the Quad. I just say that whenever a group of people get together, you must watch out for colonial control. And India has experience of that and is very sensitive to it. You've got to be conscious that your sovereignty is not being breached. And that will be breached if one of the other members of the Quad starts making long-arm statutes to govern things in your country. And I don't have to tell you which member of the Quad is capable of doing that. And we also have to watch out, therefore, that we don't slip into vassal status. I don't see any evidence that the regime in India is in any way likely to slip into vassal status. It's too strong. There's too much in India going on above the neckline. People really know, the intellect's amazing. You don't even have to ask the question. India is quite capable of joining the Quad and looking after its own interest to the best of its ability. Now, let me say that a few years ago, I wrote a paper called the Aboriginal Song Lines. The Australian Aboriginals have an ancient land title system going back some 60,000 years. And their land title system is based upon ancient allodial title. Allodial title means that you have title to the land without being responsible to anyone, not even the king. There's still a allodial title in the world. And the edges of these lands are mapped out by boundaries that are contained in ancient songs that are remembered down the years and taught to the children and the grandchildren. And I set out in the paper, based upon the research, that these lands were bordered by song lines, lines that were sung, and the songs are handed down from the fathers and the mothers to the children. And they map out something like community allodial title. Now, the colonial regime in Australia, which is the British regime that occupies Australia, can't cognize it. You explain it to them and it bounces off the side of their head. There is no cognition. They use a land title system that's used throughout much of the British Commonwealth called Torrens title. I don't know whether that operates in India. I'm just not sure. But
Mhm.
Torrens title is based upon a ship's registry. It registers bills of lading in a ship, and they've used the same system for statutory land title. And it's completely dissonant with this ancient system in Australia. And people are singing these songs, and there are nodes and networks of song lines. And it's clear to see that the colonial powers have figured out where these song lines are because they've built roads on them and they've built cities at the nodes. So that means that one way your national security can be compromised is if you teach it to your opponent and your opponent builds on your procedures and thereby induces you into a vassal status. And it's done by what we call frame transformation, convincing people that they don't have song lines, that what they really have is some sort of foreign land title. And that's the most effective invasion you can possibly have.
So in India, in different folklores that you mentioned, the hymns, we do have folklores like Bharuds or Ovis that they are called, and these are and even for some national figures or so like you have these are called povadas. So again, different folklores which actually resonate the same with in the Indian context. So basically, we say that modern society and national social construct is the direct byproduct of national and regional history, economic
Yes,
development, and
yes.
understanding of the state and the military aggressions and the war and everything. So yeah, so that's that.
Because
So
the ancient kings governed so well that their laws subsist to this very day. They were brilliant.
mhm, absolutely. So when we look at varied national ideologies, that is, are democratic or socialist, communist, or authoritarian dictatorships, what factors change or stay constant, and what should the global community derive about that nation analyzing their national security doctrine to devise a foreign policy for that very country?
Okay, let me start by saying that ideologies are views, according to Engels, views held by people based entirely in thoughts, not based on physical facts grounded in the everyday world. So any thought that comes from within the human body will be subject to feelings and affect and views and what your mother told you when you were 3 years old. And these views may be dissonant with what's actually going on in the outside world. For example, the list you read to me, I'm just looking at it now, democratic, socialist, communist, or authoritarian.
Mhm.
Where did that authoritarian come from? Seems to me that every government is authoritarian. And a friend of mine who was a minister in the state government years ago, and he and I've been friends some 40 years now, he said to me, Gary, what you've got to realize about governments around the world is the only difference between them is the names of the people running them.
Mhm.
Apart from that, they all function the same way. The current hegemonic propaganda is that there is a balance or a continuum between democracy and authoritarianism. And I think really this is a proposition that can safely be ignored. Let me explain why. Democracy derives ultimately from the works of Pericles, uh, the current version of democracy. The ideology says that to be democratic, you have to have elections. But let me just propose to you the following schema. Imagine you have a great academy in your society. In ancient Israel, it was called the Sanhedrin. In China today, where they have them and they operate this way, it's called the Academy of Social Sciences. And there are similar things in India, very obviously. And then the people in these academies of social sciences are all people with PhDs who are capable of going out into the field and determining social mischief. And then they do the research and they come back and they write up research papers on the nature of the social mischief. And then they liaise with government on this, and the government says, okay, that's a sufficiently high priority. Go out and develop propositions on how we can cure this social mischief. So far, this is exactly the same as a parliamentary system, so far, but it'll diverge soon. So all these experts go in the parliamentary system. There are people with bachelor's degrees who do this. And in the ancient system, it's people at the very top level of academia. Everyone has a doctorate. In the ancient Chinese system, they all had doctorates before they were allowed to do this. They go out and they develop conceptions of how to resolve the social mischief. And then having done that, they debate it internally in the academy until they think they've fine-tuned it. The next stage is to go out into the field and meet with the people. And still in your parliamentary system, there's still consultations with the people. But mainly these days, it's focus groups where the people are being push-polled. In the ancient system, the people are told, this is the social mischief we've identified. And these are the ways we think we can resolve it. What do you think? And then the people give their views. And then the researchers go back to the academy and they incorporate the views of the people. And this process iterates a few times until the result of it is what you would like to call a living, breathing statute. But what I would call would be a statute that's a good fit to the social mischief. And then when they get to that stage, the state, the sovereign of the state, and in the ancient Greek rhetoric, we call it the famous lawgiver, puts the royal seal on this statute and it becomes the law. And it operates very effectively as the law because the people have already agreed to it and it's already been carefully worked out and everyone's working together honestly and decently to look after the community to solve social mischief. Now, that's the ancient democratic system, the non-elective democratic system. Sounds good. Now, in the democratic system, you have an election every several years, and then you suffer while you have no input to the way they govern. And everyone gets angry and upset. And in Australia, we've just had 10 years of a government that upset everyone very, very badly. And they've gone now, and there are commissions being held that are going to end up jailing some of these politicians, because that's what happens when there's no nexus between people and government. So authoritarianism, effectively, in my mind, is elective democracy because of this lack of the ability of the people to have any input. On the other hand, some elective democracies are very, very good at listening to the people. Now, you asked me about ideology, and ideology, I explained, is the views of people based upon their own inner thoughts and the bodily feelings. It's a psychoanalytic concept of the affect and how people feel. And these ideologies can be used to create hegemonies. And Western hegemony, according to Antonio Gramsci, who formulated this while in Mussolini's jail in the 1930s, is made up of the three bourgeois groups of the managers, the entrepreneurs, and the government-recognized professionals. These are the middle class who chopped off the French monarchs' heads during the French Revolution. And they are ruling in this hegemonic coalition without any crown. It's what we call a homunculus-free hegemony. And that's why we see some of the Western governments behaving so strangely around the world. And there's nothing you can do about it because you can't talk to people like that. So the answer to your question is, how do you work out national security in these circumstances? Well, I think the only way is to develop institutions in your society, such as the ancient non-elective academies that I described before. Let them exist in society and let them advise the senior civil service officials who, as we all know, advise the elected officials. I think that answers that question.
So very rightly put. So talking about hegemony, India has, have had its brush with a power who was on their hegemonic path. I'm talking about the UK, and
Yeah.
talking about the social mischief which connects that is the revolt which led to our freedom, and talking about having people connect together. We used to have Jana Jagran, which is people coming together sometime at night, exchanging their thoughts and everything. And extrapolating that in today's, extrapolating the social mischief part, which is now, we started with that, right? We had a non-violent movement led by Mahatma Gandhi. We had, an armed raising uprising led by the Azad Hind Fauj, which was the Indian army back, led by Subhash Chandra Bose, and so we have had flavors of our, social mischiefs and uprisings and ideologies under the same umbrella. And today this has offshot to something like internal offshoots, gaining momentum into insurgencies, or getting influenced by the other powers. So relating all these things, that with India we've got a mixed bag of regional ideologies of governance under our own democratic umbrella, due to which external forces are able to influence the domestic enemy or create the domestic enemy. So
Yes.
India also faces a very unique set of security threats, that is powerful communist China with aggressive expansionism as a neighbor enemy, Pakistan as a fundamental Islamist extremist state ruled by deep state and using terrorism as the unconventional war tactics. Uh, China again funding and fueling insurgencies in the northeast India, taking the advantage of diverse ethnicities. Pakistan also fueling the Khalistani radicalism in the Punjab state in India, and China setting the chessboard with string of pearls to keep a security threat over India. Uh, so now putting the internal and external threats together. So what are your consultative points that the Indian security mechanism should look into as a prime elements to India's national security doctrine?
Well, you added the internal aspect to that question, and you were very wise to do it. I think that in China, they have attended to that. They make sure that they control the outside influences that affect the inside of their society. And their rationale is, and I think it's a reasonable rationale, that their population is very large, and anything that goes viral in a large population gets out of control very quickly and can hurt a lot of people and can end up in the fall of the state and cause big problems. And they've had their big problems. They had the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s that was disastrous for them. And even Mao himself had trouble stopping it. He ended up getting on the balcony of the Google and telling everyone, stop it. And only then did they stop it. But a lot of people died. And I know people whose parents were dragged away in that time and never seen again. And that's all in an effort to prevent these outside influences. And they, at that time, just like India, were subject to European colonial influence, and they reacted very strongly against it. Now, I went to the Aga Khan's palace in Pune, which is where Mahatma Gandhi was locked up by the British. And I remember saying to myself, if I'm going to be locked up, lock me up here. This is a great place. He must have been very comfy in there. So he was able to think things through carefully, obviously. And he was a very good strategist. And he went to Britain, and he was a lawyer, so he was able to understand how they thought. Now, when I was in Pune as an associate professor some years ago, I gave a talk, and you mentioned this in your introduction, to a large conference on Indian national security. And there was a lieutenant general there, there was a major general, there was a Navy captain who was the secretary of the Indian National Security Council. And the subject of my talk is, how can you oppose China on the South China Sea? And this is just standard academic thinking, until you know what their position is on international law. You can't just assume that some European version of international law developed by 6 or 7 Western European states who are trying to spread it as hegemony throughout the world, and it's currently called the rules-based international order, which is a nonsense of epic magnitude. You can't just imagine that everyone's going to buy into that. Now, there was a time of Pax Romana, where the Roman Empire ran a protection game and protected all these countries and built it into an empire, and they were a vicious slave-like empire. But at the same time, there was Pax Sinaitica, the whole Chinese realm of East Asia. And in those days as well, India had its own Pax realm, where it ran things under its own system, and it was an awesome system. And there was no European international law in these places. So to the conference in Pune, I presented my research, which particularly showed that the Chinese have no interest whatsoever in the decisions of international courts, not interested. The only thing that they're interested in international law, and that would allow it to apply in their view, would be international treaties negotiated between parties that are subject to their rules that they've developed along with Russia, called the rules of justice and equity. And I wrote a paper on what that was. And there are 20 or so rules that set out whether a treaty is just and equitable. You see, the Chinese ceded Hong Kong to the British in an unequal treaty. And the British rushed around the world everywhere and made unequal treaties. And nobody wants to do that anymore. So when the South China Sea arbitration came up, the Chinese didn't participate. They just sent a note verbal, which is a diplomatic document, explaining their position to the arbitrator. And the decision in that case, which was in favor of the Philippines, was entirely ex parte, without the participation of China. It's not a valid decision. So this is another example of what we call frame transformation, that I mentioned when we referred to the songlines, where the Aboriginal children are taught in the schools that their land system can be interpreted in Christian terms. This is crazy, that a system less than 2,000 years old seeks suzerainty over something that's tried and tested for 60 or 70,000 years. And this is why I said before, and I maintain this position, India doesn't have anything to worry about, because it doesn't ignore its history. It doesn't ignore what's been handed down from its ancient kings and the wisdom that was developed. And the military people I met, I'll say it again, they're wise people, very smart people. They know what they're doing. I don't think there's a problem for India. There are going to be conflicts from time to time, but every time they do occur, they settle down very quickly. The meeting of commanders between India and China up there in the Himalayas, it's an excellent idea. The commanders are meeting and working these things out, and It's semi-stable, but it's working, and they'll work something out. And I don't have any problem thinking that that's going to end up okay.
Fantastic. So the thoughts, coming from you actually make me think and actually resonate that uh, India, with its thousands of years of wisdom, social governance wisdom. So we had Kautilya, that is your Chanakya, who was Chandragupta Maurya's teacher, on which we have a Kautilya Niti, which is you can say parallel with Sun Tzu, or if we look at the military rulers or the rulers, those who had bigger campaigns, like we spoke in the initiation of this conversation. So we had Samrat Ashok of Kalinga, we had Chandragupta Maurya, we had Chola dynasty, right? So we there, and then yes, you've been in Pune, so you know the Maratha Empire, and the span that we the Marathas went up to Attock, and which is modern day Afghanistan, even neighboring to Iran. So that was a span. And
Mm.
talking about a dotted line to that national security doctrine, internal as well as external, and that has brought about some kind of, or a lot of learning in a way, all these years, and which we are implementing towards fending off these external enemies, and also handling their internal aggressions. There has to be now, you being PhD in law and you being the professor in law all these years. So there has to be a constitutional backing. Now, this is a consultative talk, and I would like you to summarize, for this, that how can you bind the criminal law, the constitutional duties of a citizen towards internal aggression as well as external aggression, in terms of information, or in terms of downright participation into counterterrorism, or even into information provision that comes in, maybe it's a social media, or maybe any other medium that would be a threat to the national security, again, domestic and international.
You reminded me of something that I wanted to say that I'd forgotten to say, and that is when the League of Nations existed, and that collapsed at the beginning of the Second World War. They spent half the 1930s negotiating an anti-terrorism convention. And I wrote about this in my seminal article on anti-terrorism financing in banking law, published in the UK some years ago. And they almost put together this League of Nations convention in 1935, but it collapsed because none of the countries could agree on extradition laws. Because what they had worked out at that time, that the essence of terrorism was one country, you see how this fits with what you've been asking, one country using an actor within its borders to exact an act of war on another country while never even entering that country. And it can be done through the media, and it can be done through giving people scholarships. It can be done by funneling money through banking, and you can create an act of terrorism in another country while you're sitting next door in the other country. It can be done by long arms statutes. And it fell apart because of the extradition laws. Nobody wanted to agree to extradite their citizens. But now that's done. In the 1980s, pretty much the whole world agreed to extradition laws. And yet, since then, the terrorism has increased 100-fold. So it's as if that as much as they've tried to do this, the fact that they've only done it in the high councils of the world and haven't involved the people of the world, that they've failed, and that the terrorism will keep on keeping on. So I think that answers that question. You've
Absolutely,
got to
and
go
that
back
is
to the ancient form of non-elective democracy. I thoroughly believe in that.
absolutely, and this is where even the UNCT struggles a lot on different parameters. So we can actually go on, and this is I'm enjoying this conversation so much, Dr. Lilienthal. But we will arrange for something else. Diving deep more into these. Topics for today. Thank you so much for your time, your insightful thoughts, and it was indeed a pleasure talking to you today.
It's my honor to have been with you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for being on Diplomacy Direct. Jai Hind.